When I talk about, I gave a talk yesterday to a large group of people, and I talked about the cycles like Bob talked about, the longer range, and also there's a 60-year cycle. It's very evident that ties to the sun and cycles in the ocean. And I talk about volcanism to the public. But I always get questions afterwards. They'll come back and say, but Joe, what about the Arctic? What about the polar bear? Those images in the Inconvenient Truth they saw. The images in the movie and in Inconvenient Truth were very powerful of the polar bear and the Arctic ice. But you can explain that away, as I discussed, from the old warm ocean cycles and the intrusion of warm water into the Arctic. And perhaps with Gackle Ridge volcanism underneath the Arctic, they discovered a large volcano took place in 1999 that may have contributed to the decline of the ice in the last decade. And the Kilimanjaro they ask about. They say, well, you talk about glaciers increasing. What about Kilimanjaro? I see pictures that it is decreasing. But as Tim pointed out, it's not just temperature that determines whether a glacier will advance or decline. The temperatures at Kilimanjaro for the last 25 years have been declining, but the ice has been decreasing because there's been a significant amount of deforestation in Central Africa near Kilimanjaro. With less trees, there's less moisture, less thunderstorms. Those thunderstorms are what deliver the snow to the higher elevation that build a glacier, and so it's been retreating from lack of precipitation, not because of any warming. And when you explain those things away, it helps the public then to perhaps accept your position on
just one. Yeah. Joe, one thing to add to the Kilimanjaro thing, with the deforestation and increase of agriculture, of course, more dust in the atmosphere, and the dust falls on the snow, darkens it, and, of course, makes it melt more quickly because of the change of the albedo, more sunlight affecting it. So that's another small factor with Kilimanjaro as well.
And Joe, I'd like to come in there, too, because you mentioned the Gackle Ridge in the Arctic Ocean. And I don't think people realize that there are underwater volcanoes in the Arctic Ocean. That's what I think is heating the ocean. The Max Planck Institute sent submersibles down into the Arctic Ocean to look at the Gackle Ridge. Now, the Gackle Ridge is 1,100 miles long. It's a chain of underwater mountains, underwater volcanoes, bigger than the Alps. And they were wondering if that was active. Well, they discovered that the Gackle Ridge is so active that they had to be careful that the heat didn't melt the cables on their submersibles. So that is what I think is heating the Arctic Ocean. I don't know how some farmer in Nebraska driving his tractor in the cornfield is going to be heating the below water temperatures in the Arctic Ocean. It's got to be coming locally.
And the same thing is happening in the Antarctic, near the Antarctic Peninsula. It is a volcanic region with volcanoes on the peninsula, above the ground, above the ice, but also underneath. And they are active underneath, and they are maybe doing the same thing, warming the water from beneath and melting the ice from beneath and causing some decay of the ice in the western part of Antarctica.
We had this is Bob again. We had mentioned about the food production, and that's one of the things I say, not by fire but by ice. I fear that we will be fighting in the streets for food long before we're covered by ice. So I would certainly recommend that people would at least have a food supply on hand.
I wouldn't disagree with that, Bob, and Chris. One could argue that's one of the reasons that the Mormons require you have a 1 year food supply in your house. But when you look at, I've worked with Chinese climatologists and with Russian, Borisenkov in particular, and they have very, very long records of both crop conditions and production and the weather. And not because they cared about the weather and how it affected, but because they knew if there was crop failure, then there was going to be social unrest, and they wanted to get the troops in place to stop the unrest. Most revolutions, the French Revolution, for example, there's always been the animosity between the aristocracy and the peasants. But what triggered it was the harvest failures, which, by the way, Benjamin Franklin predicted because of the volcanic eruptions in Iceland and peasants spending the first year, about 55% of their total income just on bread. And then in the second year, 82% of their total income just on bread. And the third year, of course, they stormed the Bastille. And so when you look at history, it is the failure of the food supply that causes people to rise up. Because mostly people will tolerate incredibly bad government, as we prove every year. But when it comes down to food, then it becomes a very, very critical issue. And I think that your point on that is well taken.
And it's aggravated by the fact that if energy prices go up, then people at the lower income have to decide between heating and eating. And that's already taking place in parts of Europe. And in England, when they had an extremely cold winter, there were stories of women, retirement, widows, living in their little apartments with the thermostat set at 50 degrees with their coat on during the day. And the cold went on for over a week, and they had to, even with that lowered thermostat, they had very little money and had to ration their food. And there were stories of people actually starving because they couldn't afford to buy food in Michigan last winter.
Yeah. I think one of the things that people forget is that before the Industrial Revolution, there was an agricultural revolution. And one of the great achievements of the U.S., besides the concept of democracy and free speech and so on, is the fact that the U.S. has reached the point where 2% of the population producing enough food for the other 98% with food left over to export. And so what we forget, and the economists forget, is that the basis of all civilization is surplus food. Surplus food is surplus time, and then you can create and do all the other things you want to do. So if we see that food supply diminish, then it as Joe is implying and Bob is implying, it eats into your time and takes away. And that's one of the concerns I have too, is because if we push the energy prices up for completely unnecessarily because of the supposed CO2 problem, and the potential within the society to come up with the solutions, to have the free time and have the people working on these issues is also diminished.
I think we're at a time where things are already happening, and I think that everything is already on its way. The question is not how many people can you get the message to, but how many people that you get the message to or make the message and the information and the science and the history available to them are going to be receptive to rethinking this subject. Because it really has to do with getting into a totally different mindset and not thinking of ice ages or weather as something local, but something from outer space and something from volcanism and something that has to do with different elements that are all connected and related, but it's ancient. This is an ancient phenomenon that is reoccurring and reemerging as it always has been, and it's natural. And so for the people who are advocates, let's say this, for those who are formal advocates and it's been their mission to help the earth and to create organic products and to save trees and save the environment, etc., all power to them. But at the same time, there needs to be an expansion of what that means with different scientific grounding that's verifiable, and putting all the puzzle pieces together to say they're not wrong and we're not wrong for being, let's say, an environmental passionate advocate, right? Not that others aren't, but people who are in that category perceive themselves as being the ones, right, who are. But now, how do they take that passion and that connectedness and that concern and open their field of receptivity to allow in a more complete composite of input, more substantive, whole systems input that has no political agenda except to help prepare people for the coming time? And, that's the task, I think.
Yeah, Kim, can I just a quick comment about that, because I've been involved in this for almost 40 years now and so on. The most common comment I get after a presentation well, there's two. One is I had my suspicions, but I didn't know enough to know. That applies to most of the public. Michael Crichton, who, by the way, shared a room at Harvard with Richard Lindzen, which is where he got all the science for his book State of Fear. But the state of fear